Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on corporate diplomacy and why this is a smart business strategy. My name is Lauren Hurst. I'm the Managing Director of GreenLeaders DC. I've really been looking forward to this session today. As a public affairs professional and somebody who has worked in public diplomacy for a long time, I think what you're going to hear today is a really solid and compelling business case for diplomacy, particularly in the corporate world. So I encourage you to stick around and shoot all your questions to us and your comments in the box at the bottom of your screen there, and we're going to get to those a little bit later. Let me introduce today's speakers. With us today are Witold Heinz, and he is the Deloitte & Touche Professor of Management at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. His research there examines the impact of political hazards by multinational corporations to engage in corporate diplomacy and to win the hearts and minds of external stakeholders. He's also the author of Corporate Diplomacy, the book Corporate Diplomacy, which you see there on the right-hand side of your screen. And we'll see a presentation on that in a little while, and later on we're going to go into a discussion about some of the important points of that book. Also with us today is Bennett Freeman. Bennett has worked at the intersection of multinational corporations, government, international institutions, and NGOs for quite a long time, and he is what you would call a consummate corporate diplomat. Most recently, he was Senior Vice President for Sustainability Research and Policy at Calvert Investments, right up the road from us here in Bethesda, one of the leaders in sustainable and responsible investing. And Bennett, I'm going to go ahead and start with you. To get a few comments from you, and then we'll dive into Witold's presentation. At GreenLeaders DC, we focus a lot on the economic drivers of sustainability, and specifically what we like to focus on is the risk that comes from things like environmental damage and resource scarcity. Now, stakeholder relations is a very important topic here because, in the end, what this is really about is about managing risk. How would you comment on that?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Lauren. It's a pleasure to join you and Vit today for this timely discussion. Companies have been dealing with risk for centuries. This is hardly a new theme, but it's a theme which has gained greater currency and urgency in the last couple of decades as more and more companies in virtually every industry have been challenged to demonstrate greater corporate responsibility, to contribute to sustainability, and to really build and maintain the so-called social license to operate. So while corporate diplomacy is hardly a new approach or set of tools for companies, Vit's book on corporate diplomacy really distills the essence of the set of tools, particularly around engaging stakeholders on a company project level, that are so critically important now. I really think that the reason why this is such a timely theme is that over the last decade and a half, we've had more and more stakeholders, whether they're local communities or international NGOs, who are more interconnected and empowered than ever before, particularly through the internet and social media, really insisting on corporate accountability, transparency, and overall sustainability. So it's more important than ever for companies in virtually every industry, especially those with projects on the ground in countries with sensitive political conditions, sometimes weak or bad governance, but particularly countries with restive communities who are anxious about the environmental consequences, the social consequences, the human rights implications of company operations, to grapple with all of these problems. So I'm really looking forward to Vit's presentation and our discussion between us, but also together with our audience, because I really believe that his book is a groundbreaking one. I say that as a practitioner who's worked on these issues both on the ground in many, many countries, different industries, but also at the global policy level.
That's great. Okay, Vin, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about your background and show us your presentation today.
Great. And thanks, Bennett, for I think that excellent sort of introduction to the topic. It's absolutely true that as companies expand abroad globally, they're confronting more and more stakeholders with more and more diverse histories. And those stakeholders impact their ability to drive profits, to drive revenue growth in more and more ways. We're increasingly aware of that. We're increasingly aware of the importance of stakeholder engagement, but we don't yet have a science for how we turn that risk and that opportunity into a strategy. We have exhortations to do more, to be better. We have claims that there are enormous risks, and we have horror stories of billion-dollar capital write-offs. But how much is enough? And which lever should we pull? Who should we talk to? What should we say? Those are the kind of questions that I get confronted with as a professor at Wharton. I've been here for 16 years, and I've been teaching a course on these topics. And over the years, as my students have challenged me, and also as I've engaged with corporations through my consultancy, Prem LLC, I've been confronted not just with the academic argument that this is important, and increasingly so, but also with the practical question of what do I do about it? And over the years, as I developed more material and more tools and more structure, I tried to put it together into this book called Corporate Diplomacy. And what it is very much a toolkit. It's a how-to book for managers like Bennett who understand the importance, but they want to know how much is enough. And maybe they're confronted with a CFO who's less sympathetic or a CEO who's a skeptic. And they have to prove the case, not with words, but with the same hard-edged, rigorous analytics that the CFO, the COO are going to come in with. And that's what corporate diplomacy is about. So let me shift over, if I could, with that into the presentation. And I'm going to try to work through the broad overview of the book, Corporate Diplomacy, but along the way tell some stories of people like Bennett, who drove value and drove revenue growth because of their ability to manage it, or who created risks and liabilities because of their failure. At the end, I'm really looking forward to the questions that come in from Lauren, from Bennett, from others, because I'm always interested in learning more and continuing to push out the frontier of corporate diplomacy. So let's start with a project. A project could be a gold mine, an oil and gas field, that someone's considering investing in today. And they're going to have to invest hundreds of millions of dollars over the next 2 or 3 years before the project generates any revenue. And once it does, it's going to take some time before it pays back that initial investment due to depreciation. And this is the financial plan that maybe a finance team, an engineering team came up with, and it's a pretty high value, strongly positive net present value project. There's going to be some cleanup costs or some remediation at the end, but this still drives, this still looks like a really good high profit project. The problem is this isn't reality. The reality is that this project has environmental externalities, social externalities, political concerns that are going to require changes, that are going to generate opposition, that are going to generate real problems in execution. And so the reality is one of two realities. There's a chance that the protests are going to get so large, there's going to be such controversy, there are going to be so many roadblocks, so many protests in front of the presidential palace, so many riots, that the project's going to be abandoned after a couple $100 million of investment. And maybe, if they have really good lawyers, about 20, 10, 15 years from now, there'll be some compensation for some of the lost investment, but that'll be heavily depreciated. And that'll lead to a pretty substantial loss. On the other hand, if they invest a little bit more in environmental remediation, in redistributing the rents to local workers, creating more local businesses, demonstrating the value to the local country, it's possible this will still be a very profitable project. But they're going to have to invest more up front, and they're going to have to live with a lower revenue stream, and every once in a while there's still going to be a protest, there's still going to be a concern, there's still going to be some changes that are required. And so the strategy, sorry, the choice is not really how do we get the purple scenario cash flow line, but how do we avoid the red and try to get to the gold. The further complication is a couple years down the road, there's going to be a new CEO. They tend to last 3, 5, 6 years, and that new CEO is going to say, wait a minute, I thought that we were we had a way of dealing with these risks. I thought we had a way of addressing these challenges. How much is it really going to cost? And the question is, can we avoid the red, do even better than the gold, but can we invest in political and social relationships that'll generate something more? Is there some way that we can get up to the green or even the blue scenarios, which have lower and higher investments up front, but lower losses in the future and more profitable investments? Sorry, as I was saying, sometimes there's a new CEO and he comes in and says, wait a minute, why are we back up on that purple line? Why is it that we fell down to the green or the blue? What happened? And he might cut the whole payment system or cut the whole strategy for local employment, trying to get back up to the original plan that the engineers and the financiers had, thinking that all the investments in environmental remediation, political and social capital are just philanthropy or just looking good or just not worth it. And we need to provide the tools that highlight the difference between the overly optimistic scenario, the realistic scenario, and the scenarios that will occur if we don't make the right investments. That's what corporate diplomacy is about. Now that's the financial toolkit, but sometimes it's easier to tell it through the lens of a story. And I'd like to turn to the story of two managers from a DC-based firm, actually, American Electric Services, that was once the largest global provider of electricity. And they expanded into the Republic of Georgia. And the manager, the general manager in charge of that expansion was a man named Mike Scully. He went in with a wildly optimistic financial plan, kind of that purple scenario, and he confronted the reality that 90% of the people in Georgia weren't actually paying for their electricity. There were illegal lines everywhere. The government wasn't paying them for the fuel. There were all sorts of complications, and Mike was trying to roll with it. He was trying to build up a communication strategy. He was confronting the government. He was out in the streets arguing with people, but he was losing money. He was losing thousands of dollars an hour or a day, turning a $30 million investment into one that was over 180 and then $300 million as he purchased generating equipment instead of just the original distribution facility, as he subsidized low-income payers with the help of the USAID and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. But it was going to be a while before Mike could turn it around and generate positive cash flow. And unfortunately, as the story I just told you on the financial side, Mike didn't have enough time. And he was replaced with a hard-edged Venezuelan manager, Ignacio Iribarren. Ignacio looked at the communications budget and said, that doesn't generate revenue today. He looked at the subsidies. He looked at the assistance of the World Bank and said, that doesn't generate revenue today. We're going to turn this business around, thought Ignacio. We're going to focus just on the finances and on the things that generate short-term cash flow. When he did that, he made enemies. And the enemies led to increasing violence against AES employees and increased pressure on AES to leave, culminating in the execution of the CFO of an American publicly traded company in the Republic of Georgia and the sale of AES Telasi to the Russian gas company for negative $30 million. They paid the Russians $30 million to take a $300 million investment off balance sheet. What's the moral or what's the lesson of this story? Mike was all heart. He came in a little naive without the right model, but he tried to adapt, and he was making the investments, and he was slowly turning the business around, but he could never justify those expenses to headquarters. He could never justify them to Wall Street. He just had the intuition they were the right thing, and he didn't have enough time to pull it off. Ignacio came in and was all about what he could prove using financial models today, and none of the political and social investments Mike was making looked worthwhile, but he actually destroyed value by cutting them all. So we need to find something in between Mike and Ignacio. Something that combines Ignacio's financial acumen with Mike's softer skill set. What does that look like? It's called corporate diplomacy. It's a combination of analytical, data-driven information on stakeholders and financial models, together with behavioral, softer skills, some focused inside the company, some focused outside the company. And what I want to do over the next 15 minutes or so is walk you quickly through what I call the 6 elements of corporate diplomacy. Starting with due diligence on the stakeholder landscape. We do due diligence on the geology, the hydrology, the electric system, the engineering system. What about our political due diligence? What's the frontier there? And then how do we turn, the next element is integration. how do we turn the data we have on the stakeholder environment into something we can use for financial analysis? Not keep it separate, not keeping it down the hall or in a cubicle, but really bringing it into the core business systems of the company. Next, once we know what we want to do, which stakeholder we want to reach out to, which issue, how do we build trust with those stakeholders? That takes an understanding of the personal relationships and the trust. Next, how do we make sure the system learns and adapts? Because we're never going to get it right. We're always going to have shocks, uncertainties, new events that we're going to have to adapt on the fly. How do we make sure we're getting in real-time data and that we're willing to make a change? We haven't dug in our heels saying this is what we're going to do no matter what happens. How do we communicate to external stakeholders? That's openness. And how do we build an organizational culture that's important, that demonstrates or argues that stakeholder engagement is important? Note that the first two elements are data-driven and analytical. The next four are behavioral. Two of them focused inside the company, two of them focused outside. That's why this is so hard. It's soft and hard skills, internal and external, all that have to be executed together, coordinating the functions of government affairs, community affairs, sustainability, communications, leadership within the organization, adaptive systems. This is not easy stuff, but this is what it takes to succeed on the frontier of emerging markets. So let's start with the due diligence on the stakeholder landscape. What do I mean by due diligence? What data are we going to gather? How are we going to visualize it? How are we going to put it in a structure that we can integrate into core business systems? One technique I use is to look at the media. Or social media for information, because what we want to know is what stakeholders think about us. Here we learn that the chairman of Australian Solomon Gold, a man named Stephen Everett, has praised the Ramsey, the regional forces led by the Australian troops, and the local police, and he's thanked the Solomons government. We can turn that sentence into data. It links the source of the action, ASG Chairman Stephen Everett, through an action, praising and thanking, which scores a 3 on a conflict cooperation scale, with 3 targets, Ramsey, the local police, and the Solomons government. Here's another one. The president of Kazakhstan, President Nazarbayev, ceremonially kicks off a mine at the Varvinskoye deposit. This is a show of support, a stronger element of cooperation linking the president of the country to the mine owned by European Minerals Corporation. We also have conflict in our media quite often. Mr. Kabila, then a rebel leader of the ADFL group, has ordered to negotiate or see their concessions sold the foreign mining companies Banro, Mindev, and Barrick. That's a -4 on the conflict cooperation scale. And here, Filipino villagers have moved to shut off water, the withdrawal of a critical supply from the gold and copper mine owned by Oceana Gold Corporation. So now we have hard data. Not just text, not just reports, but hard numbers on what stakeholders think about us. The conflict cooperation scale ranges from violent attack with the actual or potential intended death or injury to the provision of armed support and defense, with most of the action in between. And for each item on the scale, we have a whole vocabulary of synonyms, of phrases that mean approximately the same thing, and we do fuzzy matching to see where each sentence falls in that. Now we can go back to one of the core tools in the stakeholder toolkit, the 2x2, that plots sentiment on the horizontal axis, who's opposed to us on the left, and who supports us on the right, together with influence or power on the vertical axis. But instead of just sitting around the table and saying, where do stakeholders fall, what should our strategy be, where do you think this person is, where do you think that stakeholder is, we have hard data. And we've done that here for a gold mine in western Romania, the Roșia Montana mine. We've plotted each stakeholder based on the media-reported discourse and media-reported actions that they've taken. Stakeholders from Albernus Meyer, an NGO that opposed the mine, to the Romanian Parliament or the Minister of the Environment. And we've plotted how their preferences evolved from 2003 to 2008. Stakeholders on the left are more opposed, on the right are more supportive. Those that are higher up appear more frequently in the media, indicating that they're more powerful or important. Those that appear lower down are less important, as reported by the media. Now we have hard data on what stakeholders think. We also want to know why they think it. What issues do they care about? Is it land? Is it jobs? Is it contracts? Or is it environmental externalities, like livestock damage, soil and land damage, water access or pollution, dust from the roads, noise from the blasting? We need to array all the issues that drive stakeholder opinions and understand which stakeholders care about which issues and put that information together in a way that it's actionable. We use issue matrices. Issue matrices capture the key issues that stakeholders care about, arrayed from the top of the chart to the bottom based on which stakeholders care the most. So transportation infrastructure is the issue that more stakeholders care about than any others. Land use is next, and then unemployment. Along the columns are different types of stakeholders in that 2x2. Stakeholders who like us a lot and care a lot, those are the cheerleaders. Stakeholders who dislike us a lot and care a lot, those are the opponents. So now we're grouping stakeholders by type, and we're looking at how they care about, or which issues they care about. And that gives us some real insight as to what this company should do. There are 4 issues, the ones at the top, that unite the 2 most important groups of supporters and the 1 most important group of opponents. Those are 4 issues the mind needs to address. There are also 2 issues that supporters don't seem to care much about, water and community infrastructure, but opponents and challengers do. That's a warning sign. That's a set of issues that the company may not pay enough attention to, but should be sure to do so to avoid a swelling of opposition. Another way we look at the data is through network tools. We try to map out the networks that link various stakeholders and understand how they can deal with a challenge. Here, the mistaken information pushed out by radio station B that the mine is responsible for a cholera outbreak. But radio station B doesn't like the mine and won't have a meeting with the mine's general manager. They just keep pushing out the false information. The mine looks at its network of relationships and realizes that it has very good relationships with the National Health and National Fire Service and moderate relationships with the National Police, and they all buy ad time and have better relationships with radio station B. So they use these intermediate communication channels to get to radio station B and get them to moderate their story. So these types of visuals can provide key insight as to who to reach out to, which issues to prioritize, which stakeholders are more important, and then we can take that same information and use it to adapt our financial plan. How do we do that? One example is on the mining study that I mentioned earlier. We figured out what the NPV is of the gold reserves that these mines are supposed to bring to market based on their disclosure documents, and we found something quite striking. That the average mining company we were studying was trading at a 78% discount from the net present value of the gold it was promising it would bring to market. We thought, can we explain that? Could it really be that investors are discounting the mine by 80% because they think stakeholders will get in the way? We found that was actually true. Here, what I'm plotting, the dark line, is the discount from the resource valuation that investors are giving each of these 4 companies in terms of market capitalization. And the green line is the collection of stakeholder conflict cooperation data from the media. And you see the green line tracks the blue one pretty well. We can explain more of the variation in the value of these mining companies by looking at what stakeholders say or do towards them than we can by the resource value of the gold. We can do that not only at the corporate level, but we can do it at the project level. We can look at those issue rankings. Which issues are the most important? How are those linked to risks on the project level risk registry? And which public affairs, sustainability, or government affairs initiatives are going to address those risks? Then we can do a Monte Carlo simulation, understanding how the financial value or the net present value revenue stream we started the presentation with is actually going to evolve because of disruptions here in the production phase. How often are they? How long will they last? How much do they cost? And how are they influenced by the addressing of a stakeholder or sustainability initiative? We know this is all stochastic, so we have to do thousands of draws to get an understanding of the distribution of returns, and then we can assess the net present value of sustainability. What's the ROI on a land access negotiation, on local business development, on health programs? We can provide hard-edged answers using the same models and tools that the CFO is familiar with, instead of just exhortations to do more. Next, how do we build personal trust? Once we understand what are the issues that drive financial value, how do we go out to those stakeholders and actually win their hearts and minds? It's no longer enough just to say, well, this is what's going to make us the most money. We have to build a positive relationship with them, one in which they think we really have their key interests, their key concerns at heart. I use two frameworks here in the classroom and in the book. One is one that was developed by a colleague of mine at Northwestern University, Daniel Diermeyer, in his book Reputation Rules. It's called the Trust Radar. And what the Trust Radar highlights is that often managers, financiers are really good at conveying their expertise. We're technically competent. We know how to solve this problem technically. We're smart. We went to Wharton. We went to Northwestern. We went to Georgetown or Maryland. We went to one of the top schools. You should trust us. But the reality is that's only one of 4 elements that help build trust in a personal relationship. You also have to demonstrate empathy. And companies aren't so good at saying they're sorry or demonstrating an emotional intelligence quotient when they're dealing with stakeholders in emerging markets. They also have to be open, having a fence, not allowing people to see the original contract, not allowing people inside the gate. These are all things that make people suspicious or concerned as to whether they should really trust you. And you have to demonstrate that you're there for the long haul and you're willing to put in the time. If you're flying people in and out every few weeks, or if the rotations, even if they last 2 years, you're not really there for the long haul, and people see that. So you have to go beyond technical expertise to demonstrate emotional intelligence, to be open, and to demonstrate your commitment to the concerns of the stakeholder over the long term. If you do all 4 of those, you'll increase the trust space and increase the strength of your relationship with stakeholders. Another thing you have to do beyond trusting them is empowering them. This is actually a model developed in urban housing projects in the United States in the 60s, when they were trying to figure out how they could get people to take better care of their city-owned housing. And at first they started by trying to trick them or provide, treat them as if they didn't really understand what they were doing, or they weren't very smart, and we got to treat you like patients. There's something wrong with you. You won't take care of the house. We got to explain it to you. We got to lecture you. We've got to hector you. And then they started actually listening, moving up what's called the ladder of consent into informing and consultation, really listening. What was going on? What was going on with drugs? What was going on? What was going on in the communities that was causing all these problems? And then they didn't try to solve the problems themselves eventually. They actually let the owners of the housing projects develop their own solutions. They gave the people who lived in the public housing more control over security and more control over maintenance. When they actually ceded control, people started taking better care of the houses. So one of the things that's hardest for companies to do when they're dealing with external stakeholders is recognize that the most powerful way to build trust and build a relationship is to give up your control rights and let the people decide how to proceed. A great example of this I saw once when a mining company was trying to develop housing again for a community around a mine site. And they did the engineering and financial plan, and the best way to build housing was to ship in prefabricated housing from Florida and just pop it up really quickly. It was all modular. It could go up in a couple days, and they'd have these new houses. But the people wanted to use mud and use bricks that they would make locally, and more local jobs and more local workers. It would take a lot of time. It would actually be a little bit more expensive even. But think of the difference when the general manager of a mining company is slapping some mortar on bricks or putting some mud together to build someone's house and working with them for some time. Think about the strength of the relationship that occurs there. Next element is learning. We're never going to get this entirely right. We're going to have to get ways of understanding from stakeholders how we're doing, what are we missing, what do we need to change, and we need to have a safe environment in the company where someone can say, we're doing something wrong. We've actually got to change what we're doing. This is a map of Anglo-Americans' dispute or grievance system, and it tracks how any complaint at the top left that comes in via email, phone, letter, or a meeting is tracked through the system and can generate real change. At the end, there can be real changes in the strategy, real adaptation. Another company that's built a system like this and implemented it is Chevron. And in Chevron's LNG facility in Angola, they went through 7 phases of consultation with stakeholders and tracking their concerns, and they made enormous changes to the design of this project. Changes that increased substantially the time to construction and the cost of the project. But as a result, a project in one of the most corrupt, conflict-ridden, cynical countries in the world has been on the revised timetable and on the revised budget. Really striking that they were able to do this, but they did it because they adapted the original design to stakeholder concerns. Two more to go, and then we'll turn it over to questions. Communications, openness. How do we use the communication system, whether it be social media or public media, to reinforce trust from stakeholders? Here, the book goes through an example of the Romanian mine I've mentioned once or twice before, tracing through 3 different management strategies. On the left, 5 years in which the NGOs defined the project and decried it for the environmental devastation it would create, replacing a pristine Transylvanian landscape. And the company said nothing because they thought the opposition was toothless, wasn't important. Then the NGOs had defined the reality, and the project was stuck. And a new mining executive came in and tried to push back, launched a massive PR strategy highlighting the costs of not going forward with the mine, claiming that the environmentalists were anti-growth, anti-people, and they didn't have the interests of the people of Romania at heart. That campaign smacked a little bit of propaganda, felt a little too much like Ceausescu's communication strategy, and wasn't mated with operations on the ground. A new management team, importantly a Romanian one, has since implemented a strategy in which there's more consistency between what they're doing on the ground and what's being said on television. And they're letting Romanians in Bucharest speak about the importance of getting the $4 billion of revenue that Romania would get from the project. So the new communication strategy is consistent with what's happening on the ground, it's addressing the key issues, and it's using the voices of the people who were thought to be opponents to advocate for the mine. Finally, organizational culture mindset. Every employee, from the CEO to the truck driver to the lathe operator, they all have to believe that external stakeholders are important to the success of the mission. That starts with an organizational mission statement like Novo Nordisk's here, but it goes into who gets promoted, who gets recognized as Employee of the Month, who gets paid more. All these things have to reinforce the idea that external stakeholders matter. Otherwise, someone along the way will trip it up. So those are the 6 elements of corporate diplomacy. Those 6 elements you need to move forward on all of them together. And if you do, you can construct real business value for your corporation, especially in emerging markets. This is an evolving field, one that's never quite done or complete, and I hope you'll continue to track the development of the field through the LinkedIn group and the website in which I try, or the Twitter feed in which I try to convey articles that are coming up on a daily or weekly basis, new tools I come across, and new corporate diplomats like Bennett, who I think we'll turn to at this point.
Well, that was terrific presentation, Vit. Thank you. I'll just offer a quick comment and ask you a question here that I hope then can spark more of a conversation with others who may be participating. I'm really struck by your analytical approach here based on a combination of rigorous research, but also a really quite extraordinary on-the-ground experience with particular projects in different parts of the world. You referred at the outset to stakeholder engagement, corporate diplomacy as having elements of what can become a science. And in my own experience, for what it's worth, it's more of an art than a science. And I'm wondering, how you see the kind of interplay between the art and the science, the improvisational dimensions of this kind of work versus the more systematic ones, if you will. And my own view, for what it's worth, is that we can become more systematic in our approaches to stakeholder engagement, working with companies around the world in different projects, different issues, but at the same time, we have to maintain the improvisational element given the variety of circumstances, the incredible politics around projects with local communities, with international NGOs, with home and host country governments, with the media, the social media in particular. How do we work over time to get the kind of blend of art and science that I think is more realistic than just a more scientific approach?
Bennett, it's like any management skill, there has to be some data and some rigor behind it, but there also have to be smart people. And I didn't mean to suggest that we'll ever get to the point where we just turn on our magic ball and get out an answer. But I do think there's some analogies that are worth considering in terms of how far we can go on the scientific side. If you think about where the field of marketing was 50 years ago, we didn't have much data. We just had people with good intuition, good gut, a couple decades of experience, a lot of success, saying, I think we should do it this way, and I think we should use this channel, and I think we should position it in this way, and there were more and less successful people. But the data revolution that occurred throughout the 60s and 70s in the marketing field and the link to psychology, to some extent it's frightening how successful companies are now in deciding exactly how many colors of jelly beans should be in a box, or exactly where to position the cereal boxes so our kids will get them. It maybe not the best in terms of a win-win scientific approach, but there are real benefits in terms of the shareholder value. And it's become a data-driven scientific exercise that's still informed by people with good intuition, good experience, and they can use that data. And now their intuition is informed by more data, and they're responding to it. Another similar field is human relations and human capital management. The HR side used to be something, maybe not the most high status in many companies, but increasingly when we look at what differentiates the big multinationals that are successful globally, it's the sophistication of their intake, of their training, of their job rotation, of their team composition. And a lot of that is driven by, again, psychological tools, data-driven tools, tracking, monitoring. So if corporate diplomacy over the next 20 to 30 years can follow those pathways, I think we'll have a lot more data, a lot more formalization of these instincts, and we'll still have enormous scope for people who have been in the field, been in the trenches, and know what to do with the data. Importantly, they'll have much more than just their gut or their experience to rely upon. They'll have these rigorous data feeds, and so there'll be enormous value created by instinct and intuition, but some of the things that we struggle with or puzzle with today will be known, and the intuition will be playing out in a different element of the space. That's the way I describe it.
That's terrific. I agree with you. One substantive point I would add, of many I could, but just one in particular from my own experience over the years, doing a lot of work on human rights issues with multinationals and different companies, different industries, that is the growing rigor around assessing human rights risks. And there now is a whole cottage industry around so-called HRIAs, human rights impact assessments. I had the chance with my good friend and former colleague, Gare Smith of Foley Hoag, to do the first ever human rights impact assessment in 2002, 2003 for BP's Tangguh LNG project in West Papua, Indonesia, a couple thousand miles east of Jakarta in a impoverished, strife-torn province where there's still a low-intensity conflict. And Christine Bader, who some of our audience may know of with her recent book, Girl Meets Oil, was on the client side for BP, among those who commissioned and managed the project that we did. But my point in mentioning it is that human rights is a highly subjective area by definition, much harder to quantify, much less data than on the environmental sustainability side, yet at the same time, through the development of policy frameworks over the years, especially the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the outcome of John Ruggie's mandate in 2011, and tools such as HRIAs, again, human rights impact assessments, we now have ways that we can identify and manage and mitigate these risks. And it's absolutely critical in a project context, particularly extractives, other industries as well. And we're now seeing HRIAs in industries as far afield from extractives as internet and ICT. And I'm not talking just about human rights impact assessments on the ground in a place like Democratic Republic of the Congo with the conflict minerals issue. I'm talking about human rights impact assessments in cyberspace relative to surveillance and censorship issues. Companies like Yahoo and Google and Microsoft have been in the forefront of that kind of approach the last 4 or 5 years. So I do see some elements of, if not science, at least rigorous data-driven management here that are giving more clarity and certainty from both a corporate management and a shareholder value perspective to these kinds of projects, but also can help develop and maintain over time one of the key concepts that you address in your book, that namely social license to operate. And the 21st century is the license to operate century. It's all about sustainability and accountability. And in my own personal view, for what it's worth, God help the multinational corporation that is not putting sustainability and accountability into the mix in all of their operations, business processes, new investments around the world.
Great points again, Bennett. I think Christine and I have co-shopped our books repeatedly, and I really admire her work, and she often talks about that first HRIA experience. I didn't realize you were actually on the other side of that with Foley and Hoag, so that's it's great to make that connection as well. I think yes, there are elements. So we have better practices to identify these human rights risks. But then how do we, and how did John Ruggie for that matter, make the business case to address them? So one of the things that John Ruggie did when he was pushing for this universal standard is, and faced pushback from companies saying this is a liability, is he turned that on its head and he said, no, let's look at 20 cases of human rights violations, and let's look at the initial assessment of what that project is going to earn, and then let's look line by line at the P&L statements of what it actually earned. And let's look at that variance and talk about how that variance was linked to the human rights abuse. And he turns the argument that dealing with creating a universal standard for business treatment of human rights was a liability into one that it was an investment. Because he showed that these companies lost enormous amounts of money because of delays, disruptions, shutdowns, boycotts, protests, legal judgments, line after line on the P&L statement because of a human rights allegation or a human rights violation. And that transformed the business community from skeptics to advocates, or was part of a broader campaign to do so. At the project level, when you do your HRIA, what happens next? If it just stays 100 or 200 page legal assessment or human rights assessment on moral grounds, I argue it won't have the same impact as if you do the same thing John did. Let's link it to the project risks for BP in Indonesia. We might not be able to get those supplies in. Those gas tanks might get attacked. Things might get stolen. People might cut through the fence. People might attack our workers. It might be harder to recruit workers. Those are all elements on BP's project risk register that you can link human rights violations to and drive an estimate of the NPV of addressing the HRIA. And I think that next step is really critical, because as long as corporate diplomats come in with just words and just demands, and everybody else has a financial plan, and everybody else has a business case, we're not going to get where we need to go. And I agree with you, we have a long way to go in terms of addressing human rights, not just in extractives, but in high tech, in food, in agriculture, in agribusiness, across this global supply chains. But in order to do it, we're going to need data. And so I don't see them as separate at all. I think we really need to connect the dots. And I think the examples you gave provide excellent evidence of that, both at the project level and at the global level on the campaign that John spearheaded.
Okay, that's great. I'd like to take a question from the audience now. We have a question from Gary. And he asked, what is your take on the canal construction in Ecuador and China? And with respect to that, what are the impacts and some of the corporate diplomacy methods that might be used with respect to the environmental, the energy, and especially the indigenous peoples? What advice, for example, or methods do you think would be useful in making those outcomes as good as they possibly could be?
Um, so I can take that quickly. I think, Gary, you're probably referring to Nicaragua. At least that's the canal project I'm more familiar with that the Chinese are heavily involved in. And I think it raises an interesting question. I'm actually going to be there in January, so I'm sort of looking forward to exploring the region, though it's more of a family vacation. But one of the issues that the Chinese investment community is coming across is that they were a little slow to the game on the social license and on human rights impact assessments. And they're starting to see that it's costing them. And whether it's in Nicaragua, where the nominal kickoff of the canal construction was really very ceremonial, and there's still a lot of questions as to whether it's going to go forward, or across Africa in their infrastructure investments, they're recognizing they need more of these tools. And there was actually a major call for consultants to help a training program for Chinese multinationals on how to be better citizens. And I think it's the Swedish and British DFID and the equivalent of DFID in Sweden are running these programs now, both in Europe and in China, essentially training Chinese managers about how to be better corporate diplomats. I think that's a phenomenal development, and I would guess the Chinese are going to be very fast learners. I don't have a lot of specific detail on that project, but I think it's a great example. It's behind schedule, it's over budget, and there are both indigenous and environmental issues which are driving that, and the Chinese underinvested in these kinds of skills initially, thinking they could push it through, and it's not paying off as of yet. Bennett, anything you want to add?
Quickly here, that so much of the practice here of corporate diplomacy, of stakeholder engagement on the ground, through a lot of hard work and a lot of trial and error, has been largely on the part of Western-based companies, North American, U.S. and Canadian companies, and I single out Canadian as well as American because of the significant experience, for better or worse, of Canadian mining companies, particularly in Central America and the Andean region. But I'm also thinking, of course, of UK and other European-based companies. But the big challenge here, and you've hit it here, is with Chinese companies. And Chinese companies have been slow to join the party here of international corporate responsibility standards, particularly around human rights, for political reasons in that case in particular. But at the same time, we're beginning to see some indications, some examples of Chinese multinationals, including oil companies, that are beginning, and I want to be very careful here, to look at and even work on these issues, not from a moral or political perspective, but from a sheer operational risk management perspective. To paraphrase, if not directly quote, famous saying from Deng Xiaoping when asked about his attitude between communism versus capitalism, he didn't say. He said that he didn't really care if the cat was black or white as long as it caught the mouse, namely the mouse of economic development for China. And the analogy here is, as somebody who has personally and professionally been very dedicated to corporate responsibility and human rights, I don't care so much about the motivations of Chinese companies in addressing human rights issues on the ground, particularly in conflict situations like Sudan. I care more that they're doing it for whatever reasons. And if it's operational risk management, that's fine with me. But I will say that the Chinese companies are beginning to run into tremendous challenges on the ground as local community stakeholder resentment has been demonstrated in various countries where there's a huge Chinese presence. Zambia is one example that comes to mind with the mining industry, where Chinese companies, and in turn the Chinese government by extension, is learning some of these lessons for the first time the hard way. But I'm cautiously optimistic that Chinese companies are going to get into the game here for that purely pragmatic set of reasons, as have Western companies. It's just that Western companies are more susceptible to persuasion, if not campaigning, by morally and politically driven NGO activists.
Yeah, this is a very interesting topic that you bring up right there with respect to China, for example. And I saw something just recently in the media that the Chinese government is going to cease ivory sales and start cracking down on that. Now, from a corporate diplomacy perspective, this is a very sensitive cultural issue for the Chinese people because these are considered traditional medicines. And on the other side of that, of course, it's leading to a lot of slaughter of elephants and other megafauna that supply that ivory. So let me ask you that. I mean, from the Chinese perspective, what is the government's role in this? I mean, clearly they are, it's a communist country. Are they the main driver going forward, and how much influence do they have on sort of leading and pushing some of the Chinese companies to take a more to integrate more of those soft interpersonal skills and culturally sensitive skills into a corporate diplomacy type of operational framework?
It's a great question. Vit, you could go first if you like. Otherwise, I could take a very quick crack at Lauren's pretty challenging question.
Go ahead, Bennett. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's a combination of both the companies themselves very pragmatically having to deal with these pressures, but just given the political system in China and the reality that large multinational enterprises, particularly Chinese oil companies, are deeply integrated with the government at a very high political level, there has to be some guidance from pretty far up in the Chinese government. It's significant that the Chinese government was part of the unanimous consensus on the UN Human Rights Council in support of the guiding principles on business and human rights 4 years ago now in June of 2011. China has participated. Chinese company representatives and occasionally governmental representatives have participated in discussions around the guiding principles. I was on such a panel in Geneva last December at the UN Annual Forum on Business and Human Rights, where the Chinese are literally at the table. But I think it's fair to say that there's a combination of drivers there, but I would venture an educated, semi-educated, but not fully informed guess that it's more at the initiative of the companies themselves with the assent of the government rather than the government initiative that they've got to step forward fully into these kinds of policy arenas.
I think I'd probably put a greater weight on the government role. I mean, but I think, like you said in your earlier answer, Bennett, it's a question of why are they doing it? And I think if we put the desire of the Chinese government on the retention of Communist Party control, then I think, or the secure access to resource streams, then I think they see that if they want to import foreign oil or if they want foreign ore, they're going to have to address some of these human rights issues, and they're willing to pay what it takes to do it. Another example that I know a little bit better than the ivory, though I'll speak to that in a second, is dealing with environmental cleanups in China, and why is it that Ma Jun and others at the IPE are able to mobilize public support and public pressure on companies who are polluting? I think the Chinese government recognizes that there's a real threat around mobilization of citizen opposition to environmental costs, to air pollution, to water pollution. And if they look across the rest of Asia, a lot of the revolutions that unset military or authoritarian regimes in Asia were triggered by environmental protest. And so the government is leading and responding to this pressure slowly in a not completely frontier mechanism, but they're starting to respond in a much more thoughtful way. And in Ivory, it's interesting that there's both a Chinese government involvement, but also leadership from the famous Chinese basketball players at Yao Ming, who's really behind this campaign. So I think there's some sense of maybe international standing and international status that's driving this, that if China is going to be have a seat at the table and be a great power, that they shouldn't be responsible for the extinction of the rhinoceros and the elephant, which they could have been. So the Chinese government's incentives are complex. It's about maintenance of Communist Party control, economic development, international status, and if you put all those things together, there's a lot of corporate diplomacy that can still happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the, again, a very compelling evidence base there of the risk management aspect of corporate diplomacy, that it is a sound investment for the long term. And to use an analogy with climate change, a lot of people talk these days about the resilience of cities to the changing climate. Corporate diplomacy is a great way to build resilience into a company because if something does go wrong and you do have trust with those local populations, they're going to give you the benefit of the doubt rather than the other way around. So I'd like to switch right now to go into more of the practical aspects of your presentation bit. And just to give you a scenario, say you have a manager who is at a company and they recognize the importance of corporate diplomacy, but they do have a situation that you described earlier, where maybe the operational side or the executive side says, well, we don't really know this much about corporate diplomacy, we don't understand it, and therefore, as a result, they don't really value it too much. How would you as a manager go about convincing and actually building the stakeholder relationships within your own company to convince people that this is a good and compelling and sound investment?
Well, there's a real irony in what unfortunately happens, in that you have someone who believes in it, who believes in the importance of external stakeholders and in getting inside their shoes and understanding their values and their culture. But then when that same person turns inside the company, they dismiss or denigrate the values of the CFO or the COO. You've got to behave the same way with the internal stakeholders as you do with the external. You have to understand what motivates the CFO and the COO and show that you have a shared purpose. So if it's a financial balance sheet, or if it's operational excellence, or if it's retention of workers, you have to show that what you're doing impacts their key performance indicators. And then you have an alliance and an ally and someone who cares about what you want. So you have to understand the internal stakeholder and show that you have a common purpose. That would be my strategic recommendation. I lost the audio. Sorry, Lauren. Nope.
Bennett, can you hear us?
Yes, I'm on.
Okay. What would be your response to that, to somebody who is trying to convince his fellow managers that corporate diplomacy is a good investment for their company?
I would point to Newmont Mining's Conga project in the Andean highlands of Peru and make the point that I can't remember if it's a $5 or $6 billion project that's one of the other huge magnitude that has been on hold now for 3 years this spring, since there was a local community unrest. Unfortunately, security forces deployed, local indigenous community members killed, and here you have a project that really is a critical one to future revenue streams of Newmont Mining that is sitting idle as a result of a effort to engage local community that didn't work. And it's quite interesting that it's Newmont Mining, because it's a company that has been at it with community engagement, particularly with indigenous communities, for about a dozen years now with some success, particularly in the Ahafo project region in central Ghana, which I visited back in 2008. And this example is a particularly compelling one, not only because it's a huge number here, 5 or 6 billion, but a U.S.-based multinational and a company that really has worked harder than most, in my experience, than others, to undertake community stakeholder engagement, build that kind of license to trust. And I think it's a cautionary tale about the extent to which the stakeholder engagement at the local community and project level remains at least as much an art as a science, yet at the same time a cautionary tale of what can go wrong either if the company doesn't get it right, but also a cautionary tale of not trying at all. I would give one other example, which is one we alluded to earlier in the discussion here, and that's BP's Tangguh project in West Papua, Indonesia. And what's quite remarkable there is all the work that BP, a much derided company since Deepwater Horizon, but nonetheless all the work BP has done since about 2001, and not just with the human rights impact assessment, that Gare Smith and I did in conjunction with Christine Bader and others at BP, but a whole combination of broader social risk impacts assessments, environmental risk impact assessments, and social investment with the local community to generate jobs and income streams that cumulatively over the years have meant that there really hasn't been any serious conflict, certainly not one with any violence or fatalities in the life of that project in a very politically sensitive part of Indonesia. So that's an example of what can go right if a company starts early and stays at it for a number of years, as BP, to its credit, has in that case.
Okay, great. We're just about out of time here, but I have one final comment and a little question for both Bennett and Vitt, and that is the impact of social media. And let's just look ahead into the future here for a moment. Internet penetration continues to increase, including in developing nations now, where we have seen a lot of corporate diplomacy issues that you might say. And Vitt, let me ask you, I mean, with the prevalence of social media, the ability of anyone to film an event or something and put it up on YouTube for anyone to see, how important is corporate diplomacy in the future as that capability continues to devolve to each individual citizen with a smartphone?
It's critical. I mean, you really hit on a key driver of the business case. It's that anyone with a phone anywhere can capture anything you do, and it can capture any element of your supply chain. Ask Nestle about why they've gone to sustainable palm oil. It was under pressure from Greenpeace and others who were highlighting the impact on the orangutan and linking the potential extinction of the orangutan to the chocolate, or a small ingredient in their chocolate bars. Ask people about sustainable cotton, about sustainable chocolate. I mean, it's the exposure of the supply chain, not just in extractives, that's driving this. So I think it's going to be a key driver, and it's going to continue to expand into industries that we hadn't previously thought of through consumer awareness campaigns.
And Bennett, do you have a final comment on that?
I think that's right. We're going to see continued pressure here from local communities, but also just listening to Vitt mention Greenpeace, from that NGO and a number of others that are going to continue to challenge and in certain situations even confront multinational corporations. So, just sort of tie it all together, and go back to a couple of our opening propositions here. I do think that companies are going to be more challenged than ever to build and maintain a social license to operate. And I'm not just talking about extractives with on-the-ground projects. I really have in mind companies in a variety of industries, a variety of issues, whether it's in all the way from the jungles of Indonesia to cyberspace. It's going to be very, very challenging. One dimension here that we didn't really get into of corporate diplomacy, but I think is worth a whole further conversation, is corporate diplomacy at the national and the international policy level. Vitt's book very usefully and tangibly looks at these issues from an on-the-ground project-level perspective, and yet at the same time there's a whole new dimension of corporate diplomacy, not entirely new, but one that's been developing and taking on new elements over the years, from human rights to climate to other aspects of environmental sustainability, where companies have both challenges and opportunities to interact with other stakeholders at that policy level that's so fundamental to shaping the business environment. So I look forward to further discussions around that theme, because that one, particularly for the largest multinational corporations, is really an increasingly vital element as well of corporate diplomacy.
That's great. I think that's a great final comment. One of the things that we say here at GreenLeaders DC is that sustainability is enlightened self-interest, and that's about managing risk. And I don't think there's a better example than that of the examples that we heard today in terms of some of the companies that have discovered that having a robust corporate diplomacy policy and strategy in place really is in their own self-interest. It's enlightened self-interest. So we're going to leave it there. I'd like to thank everybody for attending. I especially like to thank Vithold Heinz and Bennett Freeman for being with us today. If you registered for this webinar, we will send out a recording for this, so you'll be able to access that at your leisure. And that's all we have for today. Again, thank you very much to our speakers and for everybody for attending. And we'll see you next time. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Bennett.